Okay, I have a question to ask you. It's an audio question relating to how things sound. But before I actually ask that question, the important thing or for you to have, is a means of listening to this recorded sound um, that is trustworthy, that you can actually trust. Now, what do I actually mean by that? Um, the easiest way to judge whether whether you're going to be monitoring via headphones or loudspeakers like this, um, whether you can actually trust it, is just to do a simple recording test. So, if, for example, you get a friend around, um, set up a microphone like this, a good quality microphone like this 1 inch condenser mic, or a, perhaps even a half-inch might even be sonically better, because it won't have the little bump at the high end that typically you get with a 1 inch condenser mic. But you set up a mic like this, have a friend maybe 1.5 meters away, or I guess that's around about 5 feet if you're more accustomed to imperial measures. That is 5 feet away from the microphone, and have a conversation with them and actually record the conversation through the microphone. And then post conversation, and while you're actually having the conversation, pay attention to what the tone of their voice sounds like. Then, post conversation, play back your recording through either your headphones or your monitor, whichever you choose to use, or whichever you want to assess. And of course, it's important to play it back at the same sort of sound level that you experienced in the conversation itself. And if you do, and what you hear sounds very representative of what you heard at the time you were having the conversation in terms of tone, then you can say you have a reliable and trustworthy means of monitoring. If, on the other hand, what you hear is tonally completely different, then it's unreliable. Now, for me personally, I have these, 20, well, probably almost 30-year-old Sennheiser HD 450s with re-implemented foam covers because they disintegrated. But they're actually pretty tonally neutral. They're quite reliable. The only deficiency I have with these in terms of monitoring is they tend to droop off at the high end a bit. My monitors, they're very trustworthy for me in terms of tonality. I have no issues with them whatsoever. Just for argument's sake, and to point out that there are particular issues that can arise, I wanted to get a set of headphones that were closed back and totally enclosed the ear to have good isolation for recording purposes. And I was bold enough to actually buy these things, ATH M50X Audio Technica, on the strength of a published online review saying how wonderful they were. And I can honestly say I was completely gutted and disappointed when I got them, because they are, well, mechanically they're designed very well. They're comfortable to wear. They have very good isolation. but tonally they are completely off the wall. In terms of a description of how you would characterize them, to me they sound like if you got a neutral pair of headphones, plugged it into an amplifier and turned bass and treble controls to max. That's exactly what they sound like. So it's completely useless as far as making assessments on how things sound, and I definitely wouldn't want to use them for mixing or anything, recording work, because it simply, you can't trust what you're hearing. So given that, I'm assuming here that you have a reliable monitoring or means of monitoring audio, whether it's headphones or monitors, loudspeakers, doesn't really matter. But here I've recorded two microphone recordings of essentially the identical little fragment of music, just made up on the spot by me. Not very well, not great performance, on a nylon string acoustic, i.e. classical guitar, like, well, it's this guitar basically, in two different configurations. In one configuration it's near field, maybe sort of that sort of distance away from the guitar body, and the other configuration is more like say 5 feet, 1.5 meters away, something like that in terms of distance. So what I'd like you to do is to listen to those both one after the other and pay attention to the tonality of the instrument, and then ask yourself which one most represents what you expect as a listener, rather than a performer, but as a listener, like you were in a concert listening to somebody perform, what you would expect a classical acoustic guitar to sound like. If I actually do that myself, generally speaking, the outcome that is most representative of what the instrument actually sounds like to me, in terms of my I don't know, musical memory of the timbre of instruments, is the second case, the one that's recorded at about 1.5 meters or 5 feet away from the instrument itself. That has the most representative tone for the instrument. Close in for the near field case, the instrument sounds overly pronounced in the low frequencies, and it generally has a wooden feel to it. The transient material in terms of finger plucking and the like, again, sounds a little bit wooden rather than what I normally associate with fingerstyle classical guitar. So then the question is, why is that? So why does the near field case sound tonally distorted, whereas the far field one sounds much more representative? Here I offer an explanation of why that is the case. So the first thing you need to know before we can explain the difference between near field and far field recording of an instrument is the concept of a point source. Point sound source is basically sound emanating from a single point radiating in all directions equally, with equal intensity in all directions. Now the consequences of that I can illustrate. I'll use a ruler because it's easier to draw it accurately. So let's say that this is our point source here, and we just focus on a small sector, a small arc of what's radiating from that origin. Oops, that didn't quite work. I'll get that right. I'm using a ruler so that, it will actually look geometrically correct. So here's our point source. If we now consider I don't need to use the ruler for everything, but we'll consider 2 points, one at this distance and one at a distance, oh, that's not even right. What have we got there? It's around about, say, here. So this is a distance r, this is a distance 2r from the point source. So if we can consider the area in which it's radiating through, we've got one area here, and here we've got another area here. Now, because this is twice the distance away from this one, if that length there we call delta, that length there, it wasn't a very, I'll say that one there, will be 2 delta. So the area here, that area, is going to be 4 delta squared, and that area there is going to be, let's just label that A1 and A2 or something like that. A1, A2 is just going to be delta squared. Now if the power, let's say the power going through this area, the total power going through that area is, let's designate it P. Because of conservation of energy, if there's no attenuation, basically that same power is going to be flowing through that area there. So the power density, as in the power in power per unit area, obviously here is going to be P on delta squared, and in this case it's going to be P on 4 delta squared. So you can see that the power density, which you can call the sound intensity, which will actually relate to sound pressure level by a square root relationship, is going to be 1/4 of the intensity at this point here. So if we look at that in a log space, as in decibels, power relationship between decibel quantities is a ratio. So if we call that, say, I1, that's I2. So the dB relationship between that point and that point is going to be basically 10 log base 10 of, depending on which way around you want to do it, I'll do it this way, I2 on I1, which is going to be 10 log base 10. If you divide those two, what you end up with is 1/4, which actually turns out to be 6 dB. So that's the base relationship with sound propagating from a point source. So if you double the distance from the point source, you go down, and that should be minus, in attenuation of minus 6 dB, or if you multiply it by 10 times the distance, then you're going to drop by 20 dB. Okay? So that's all well and good. So if you actually plot that in terms of a relationship of like sound level with distance, you can draw a graph. You'll have dB on this axis. Yeah, that's right. Because it's a 1:r relationship. If you do your plotting as, if you put this on a log scale, so that's log r, then you're just going to get a straight line, and it's going to be a straight line, and that slope there, that slope is going to be minus 6 dB per octave of r, or minus 20 dB per decade. Oh. So I think you can see that the closer you get to a point source, the stronger and stronger the intensity becomes, and it's basically a singularity. So if you're exactly at the point source, the sound intensity is going to be infinite, which obviously doesn't exist for real sources. So now we can move on. Understanding that, you can actually utilize the concept of a point source and Huygens principle, which basically says that you can represent any wavefront as a sum of contributions, infinite sum of contributions of point sources along the wavefront. So you can consider what the consequence will be for say a transducer, like a loudspeaker. So if I, for instance, draw, let's say this is an infinite baffle, goes on forever, that direction, goes on for infinity, that direction, and we've got a transducer in here which is moving in and out basically, which creates a wave front coming out here. Because it's a finite width wave front, what will happen is when you're close to the transducer, the wave motion remains parallel, but as it moves further and further outward, it will transition to a spherical wave. So let's just, so basically what's going to happen is these are going to start curling outwards, and eventually it becomes just a full-on spherical wave. And this you can actually deduce just by doing an integral sum of whatever point sources along this boundary and seeing what happens as you extend further outward. Because of the phase relationships between it, you get this so-called diffraction occurring, so it spreads out. And the consequence of that is, and this transition between, oh, that's another thing I should say, the transition between, if I call this the diameter d, the transition between planar wave to a spherical wave, sort of, well, where it transitions from purely planar to purely spherical is going to be some constant of proportionality times d. So it's related to the diameter. So now if you translate that into, say, the sound pressure from a loudspeaker at a distance, again, we'll do our log plot. So this is log, I'll call it, I'll still call it R, say. And this is dBSPL, for instance. The idealized simplification of the behavior is you have, actually I'll start a bit low and I'll explain why. If I start it here, it'll be like this. This is a simplification, and it's like that. But in reality, obviously, that you have this sort of transition. So the real response is like this. So basically, you would call, in terms of a transducer response, you would call this the near field. Oops. And this is the far field. And this distance here is some constant of proportionality times the diameter of the driver. So now, if you've ever, let's see, if you've ever stuck your head in front, right in front of the drivers in your loudspeaker, you will have noticed that the sound intensity of the sound coming out of the tweeter is a lot louder, well, substantially louder than it is coming out of the woofer. And you think, how can that be if when I'm listening to it, normally it sounds balanced? Well, that's simply because the diameter is smaller, and it's because of the smaller diameter where it transitions to transitions from a parallel wavefront to a spherical wavefront is closer to the driver. So, for instance, if this is our woofer response, if I now had a tweeter and I wanted tweeter that was, say, a quarter of the diameter, and I wanted it to have the balanced far field response, let's say I draw it here, because it's a smaller diameter, it's going to transition to planar closer to the driver. Say, for instance, here. So as a consequence, you can now see that if I'm close to the driver, the tweeter response sounds a lot louder than the woofer, simply because the diameter of the tweeter is, say, that, and the diameter of the woofer is that. So where it transitions to a parallel wavefront rather than a spherical one is much closer to the driver, which is a good reason why you don't want to be super close to your loudspeakers, because, well, one reason, because you're going to be distorting the frequency response. So what else can I say with regard to that? this characterization of near field and far field, you've got to bear in mind is different than what you're probably more accustomed to, because there is another definition that relates to sound in enclosed spaces. So for instance, if I had a room, an ambient room, and I had a point sound source and I was monitoring the sound pressure level at a distance R from that sound source, what you end up with in terms of how that, again on a log scale, how that sound pressure changes with distance, you get a behavior that looks like this. So basically, when you're close to the sound source, because this is an idealized point source, we're not worried about the fact that it isn't, it's going to be falling at a rate of 20 dB per decade or 6 dB per octave, and then at some point the reverberant field will take over and it'll go like that. So again, this is idealized, so in reality it's a transition. It's a transition like that, a smooth transition. And then in this scenario, this is called near field, and this is called the far field. And maybe you can call this transition region here as the midfield. And in terms of the room characteristics, this level here, where it transitions from the attenuation with distance, which you'd normally expect from a spherical sound source or a point sound source, where it transitions from that to a constant intensity because of the reverberation in the room, is governed by how much damping there is in the room. So in a highly damped room, this would extend out further down. So this is high damping. And this is low damping. So two things you can note from that. One, the reverberation level in a high damping case is going to be lower than in a low damping case, and also in a high damping case, the distance you have to go away from your sound source before you transition to the reverberation dominating is greater. So in a low damping environment, to actually transition to the sound pressure level increasing as you get closer to the point source, you have to be closer to the source. So that's basic room acoustics there. So that is distinct from what I was attempting to discuss, but it's worth noting the difference between it. So now, what of the situation of an actual instrument and the recording of an instrument? Let's say I'll try and draw a guitar here or something like that, for instance, with a perspective view, which makes it even more challenging. But let's see. Let's put a sound hole there. Yep. Well, you get the idea anyway. So we've got our guitar here, right? So now, consider the situation of, well, first thing to consider, Any real instrument is a distributed sound source. What do I mean by a distributed sound source? The sound is not emanating from one single point. There's sound that comes from vibrations across the whole body of the guitar, across the whole length of the strings, everything. So it's all contributing. Now if you go and put a microphone here, for instance, let's do it in a different color maybe. Now you'll see that you've got a path, possible path, sound path there, possible path here, possible path here, here, another path here, another path here. What do you notice? Well, all the path lengths are different, and they're radically different. And basically, again, you can employ, although it's a more complicated relationship in terms of the various point sources on the guitar have a complex phase relationship. They're all not coherent in terms of phase. They're all differing in phase. But in terms of distance, they're all different and radically different. So basically, if you point a microphone in close proximity to a distributed sound source like a guitar, you're weighting the sound most heavily to whatever is closest to it, because again, if you plot that relationship of whatever, this is like the log of, say, D1 on D2, two different distances, versus sound pressure, sound pressure level. It's falling at this 6 dB per octave. So like in this case, for instance, I could say maybe this distance here as opposed to that distance there, they're massively different. So whatever sound contribution you get from here to the microphone is going to be what? Oh, I don't know, it's probably, I can double it once, twice, almost 3 times. So it's probably going to be about 18 dB lower. And similarly, some of these, like that might be 6 dB lower, and etc., something like that. So they're all different. But now, consider what happens if, instead of having your microphone, I could have actually left that one there, but doesn't matter. Consider now what happens if I put my microphone here, for instance. I'll draw it with a different colour. And again, now what do the distances look like? They're all much closer to one another. So if I took a ratio of that to that or whatever, so in terms of the overall contribution of each point to the microphone, they're only going to be maybe at most say 2 to 3 dB different, if that, probably less. Whereas in the other case, close to the body of the body of the guitar, the variation you could have is upwards of maybe 18 dB or so. So as a consequence, whenever you close mic something, you're always going to be distorting the timbre or the tonality of the instrument. It's always going to be most influenced by whatever it's closest to. So if that's the sound hole, then it's picking up a lot of the radiation off the sound hole. If it's further up on the fretboard, then it's probably that or whatever. So wherever you put it, you're going to alter the tonality of the instrument, as opposed to if you're trying to compare what the instrument sounds to you as if you put your listener hat on rather than your performer hat, what a listener would typically hear if you were playing a guitar in front of them. It would be completely different because typically the listener is going to be a substantial distance away from the guitar, such that these differences in path attenuation are going to be relatively small, so it's all going to be similar. So that is why when you do a distant miking of an instrument, it sounds much more natural than a close mic'd one. Close mic'd one, the timbre is going to be altered and exaggerated in various directions depending on where you place it. So the upshot of that is whenever you close mic something, if you want a natural sounding instrument, invariably you have to have equalization. You have to apply EQ. There's no ifs and buts. It's impossible to do any other way. So then the other question beyond that is then why would you want to record near field? Well, I think that anybody who's done recording of multiple instruments will understand that very simply, and that is, well, there's two main reasons. One is noise, both environmental. You want to minimize environmental noise. Your eyes also wants to minimize instrumentation noise as well, and both of those will be reduced by close miking. And the second important issue is isolation between instruments, or leakage, if you want to call it that. So if you're recording a band, for instance, if you want to have an easy time of trying to mix them, obviously you want to close, and they're playing live, you want to close mic them, because it makes it that much easier to separate the levels of each instrument, and also avoid, well, minimize the issue of phasing effects, whereby you've got multiple microphones picking up coherent sources but with different phase relationships, so you get cancellation and the like. There is one other aspect to this as well. That comes into play probably more so in percussive instruments and things like that when you're close miking, and that is the influence of close miking on transient behavior as well. So for instance, if I were to draw, say, this is maybe a snare drum or something like that, and you strike it with a drumstick here or something like that, with something like a drum, there are a whole host of different modes of vibration that occur on the drum skin, drum head, drum skin, whatever you want to call it, and some of those modes are going to be such that they're very poor at actually radiating outwards. So for instance, if I were to draw regions of a positive mode and anti-node, node and anti-node sort of behavior, indicate them with pluses and minuses. For instance, you might have, say, something like this occurring. It's entirely plausible that you can have something like this, a modal pattern that's like this. So you see, because you've got all these antiphase regions, you have to look in the far field. The contribution is going to be the sum of all these pluses and minuses. So if you sum them all together, you say, I've got 5 pluses and 4 minuses, so it's effectively 1 plus, right? But now, if I were to just put a microphone close to here, the calculus of that no longer works because the levels are all different. So now it's going to be picking up this mode really strongly, and it's not going to be picking up this one very strongly, or these, or these. These are progressively louder, these, etc. So the consequence of that is, if you close mic a percussive instrument like that, where you have all these complex modes occurring when a drum head is struck, you're going to be exaggerating certain modes that in the far field you don't actually hear to anywhere near the same sort of extent. And it's even more complicated than that as well, because if the actual drumstick is struck near where the microphone is, you also get these really short transient responses that again don't show up anywhere near as much in the far field, and that is because essentially you also are picking up a localized like click sound emanating from the drumstick itself. So you see, you again, because if you think of a drum head, right, the actual size of the drum head is relatively small. So any click sound that emanates from here, it's acting as like a point source. And you remember the relationship of our point source, so distance away. So because the microphone is so close to where the drum strike is, you get a really strong transduction of that transient. Whereas if you move away from it, it very quickly attenuates in level, because it's this 1 on R relationship. So therein is the bane of recording drums, trying to control transients that occur because of the drumstick and the proximity of it to the microphone. So if you've digested what I've digested my explanation with regards to why near field recording actually distorts the tonality of real instruments that actually produce sound acoustically. Pretty much any instrument, really. It doesn't matter what it is, even if it's an electronic instrument such as an electric guitar, but you're recording via a speaker cabinet. The same arguments all still apply, in that a close mic in it is going to sound completely different to what it sounds like in the far field. And the far field is going to be more representative in tonality to what a listener would normally hear in terms of a recording of a musical instrument. So the upshot of all that is, if you're going to be close micing any instrument, whatever it is, Doesn't matter. Invariably, you have to use some degree of equalization. You can't be puritanical about it and say you're not going to equalize. Yeah, the best you can do in a puritanical sense is find a microphone that's got a characteristic frequency response that's going to compensate for the distortion in tonality that close miking does. So in effect you are equalizing, but you're just equalizing through the frequency response of the microphone rather than physically doing it through an EQ. But invariably, close miking requires some sort of equalization to make the instrument sound natural. And there obviously are a lot of benefits in close miking in terms of reduced noise, both environmental noise and electronic noise from the mic preamps, reduced issues of leakage, better instrument isolation when you're doing multi-track live recording. So there's a lot to be said for close miking, but if you're going to be close miking, be prepared to do equalization. Distant miking gives you the right tonality. You're going to have issues with leakage if you live recording multiple instruments. You're also going to be picking up the room reflections. They'll feature more prominently in the recording, which can have implications into how things sound and whether they're realistic or not. But there are ways of dealing with that as well, which I'll cover later in another video, specifically related to my spatial panning plugin, because that essentially to preempt that. The reason why that crops up is because if you want to make a monophonic recording of a sound source that has recorded ambience in it, the essential problem to that recording in terms of you reproducing it is that all the ambience is coming from the one direction, the same direction as the primary sound source, and that's what makes it sound unrealistic, because you can hear that it sounds like it's in a room, but it's all coming from the one direction, which is akin to, I don't know, you're listening to a performer inside a hall and you're standing outside the hall listening to it in a doorway. That's probably the closest thing that would represent it in terms of a physical reality, which is obviously not typically what you want in a recording. So if you can introduce early reflections, whether the artificial early reflections in that sound stream, so that you get reflected content coming from different angles within your stereo or surround sound reproduction, if it's surround sound, coming from you at different angles, then it doesn't matter if in the recording it actually contains monophonic reflections, because they all get reinterpreted by your brain as coming from different directions when you hear multiple reflections coming from different directions. So it in effect disguises the problem. But yeah, I'll get into that in detail at some other point in time. If you'd like to support the work that I do, then consider purchasing software that I have written, available at the Harbel website. All the software there is available for free demonstration. It's fully functional. It's not crippled in any fashion. There's also a free limiter plugin software available there currently is the Hubble Harmonic Balancer standalone application and a host of AU and VST compatible plugins. All very useful, I might add. You can currently purchase all or any of those pieces of software at a 75% discount using the discount coupon code shown. This coupon will expire at the date shown as well. If you happen to miss out on the particular discount, in future videos I'll be offering the same discount going forward. If you found this video useful, like and subscribe. And if you've made it this far, thanks for watching, and cheers until next time. Thank you.